Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest press briefing from the Foreign Press Association in New York. And we seem to be at a sort of a turning point for presidents all over the world, between bad hair in Argentina. Now we have a disputed ex-president, well, how should we say, a lame duck presidency in Georgia, which is very dubious because the new one is won't be picked until this weekend, and then will be picked in a dubious process, handpicked by a billionaire. In America, of course, we have another presidency coming up, also handpicked by a millionaire, but a different billionaire. That we have strange, how should we say, well, oligarchs, Elon Musk, Bidishvili in Georgia, and they seem to be everywhere. I mean, they should just count up the money and declare the elections on the strength of it. But it's especially confusing in the case of Georgia because it's very difficult. It's an intensely patriotic nationalist country, and yet the alleged ruling party at the moment is implicitly on a pro-Russian ticket, and yet it doesn't dare say so because that would lose it. And Tinatin is going to explain this. I should also explain that 3 or 4 years ago, I was briefly in Georgia advising the then president as on the media strategy, and the idea was how, as a nominee of the Georgian Dream, he could build up an independent presence for the presidency, which was thwarted because the last thing that Georgian Dream's owners wanted was an independent presidency, and this guy showed too much signs of independence. But one of the interesting things was I was saying, well, why don't you do broadcasts in Russian? And they said, no, we can't do that. So here was the pro-Russian party that absolutely refused to use Russian in its press releases and broadcasts, even though many people in Georgia, including a lot of the minorities, speak Russian, and a lot of the near abroad to Georgia, that they were susceptible to TV in Russian. So it was a strange mix where the nationalism was tempered by intense anti-Russian chauvinism, I would say. It goes so far as to say, on the part of many Georgians. There wasn't, the only sign I found in Russian in the whole of Tbilisi was at the back of a tavern where they'd forgotten to take it down, I think, and a few old signs roundabout. So it was very difficult to reconcile. And Tinatin, having been brought up in Georgia and also in Moscow and in Washington and London, is going to bring her cosmopolitan yet locally based expertise to explain to us just who are the Georgian Dream and what are they? Do they stand for anything apart from getting money and power?
Ian, first of all, it's great to be here with you and very happy to join you as always. I think above all, and you and I have talked about this in the past, the Georgian Dream is pro itself. They will do anything and everything they can to stay in power, and not just the Georgian Dream, but its de facto leader and its honorary chairman, Bidzina Ivanishvili, a Georgian billionaire who actually made his billions in Russia, which is not shocking because that was the case for many who made their fortune in the 90s, and that was in Moscow. So he does continue to remain very closely affiliated, albeit implicitly, but nonetheless closely affiliated with those at the vertical of power in Russia. So in many ways, he has been held hostage by the Kremlin in terms of holding access to his assets. On the one hand, in Moscow, on the other hand, the West also holds him hostage to a certain degree in terms of maintaining their control over Ivanishvili's Western assets, because he is, after all, also a French national, which we should not forget. So in many ways, over the past few years, he's been trying to go back and forth in this balancing act to remain pro-Georgian, but at the same time be quite pro-EU in terms of, on the face of it, maintaining Georgia's Euro-Atlantic integration plans, the long-term plans, and on the other hand, cozying up more and more to Russia, not explicitly, but at the same time, especially since 2023, when, as you recall, the Georgian Dream initially rolled out the very controversial foreign agent law, which was essentially a Russia-inspired law. They had to be careful to not make it look like they were being told to do so by Moscow, but at the same time, it was very clear, because otherwise it made absolutely no logical sense whatsoever, because the Georgian Dream was moving quite comfortably toward a re-election, a comfortable re-election that was not going to be a contested election that we saw on October 26th, just a few weeks ago. But at the same time, they not only proceeded with the foreign agent law by bringing it back in 2024, but the anti-Western narrative and statements continued to escalate and get a little bit out of hand, where they can no longer claim that they remain pro-EU and that they remain focused on staying on their path toward eventual EU integration. So while they will not, as you said, Ian, explicitly admit that they are pro-Russian, because that would just not only alienate the majority of the population that is very anti-Russian for very obvious reasons in terms of Georgia's not just recent but also longer-term history, but also that they would provoke the backlash that we are seeing in the streets of Tbilisi and beyond, where the people are no longer just protesting the very controversial decision on the Georgian Dream's part to halt its EU accession-related reforms and that move toward opening talks with the European Union. But moreover, they are protesting Georgia's pivot away from the West, and therefore the only alternative being Russia. So they are pivoting towards Russia, whether or not they admit it directly. And they are essentially going to try to do whatever they can to ensure that the country is in Russia's direct orbit, which, of course, who has everything to gain in this case from all of the chaos in Georgia at the moment? Not so much Ivanishvili, but more directly Vladimir Putin.
So the recent events in Damascus could be seen as a shot across the bows for people who want to do Russia's bidding.
Yeah.
Is there a plane on the airstrip at Tbilisi waiting for Moscow to take the Georgian Dream people there, or are they stable enough that they don't have to worry about that, despite the mass crowds?
Well, the crowds are pretty large scale. I mean, the protests have been large scale, and unlike, I would like to stress this, unlike the prior protests that we saw both in the spring of 2023 as well as in the spring of 2024, but not so much perhaps in the immediate aftermath of the contested October election. Now, these protests have actually expanded far beyond Tbilisi. They've spread to other cities and municipalities in the country for the first time in many, many years. And as I said earlier, the Georgians took to the streets after the Georgian Dream's decision to unveil its controversial decision to halt the country's efforts to join the EU, in complete opposition, by the way, to the country's constitution. But, you know, all of this ultimately comes amid claims that the Georgian Dream rigged the recent parliamentary elections. Both President Salome Zurabishvili, who maintains her mandate until at least the 29th of December, and the opposition coalition leaders are all rejecting the election results, labeling the so-called ruling party as an illegitimate government that's pulling Georgia into Russia's orbit, as I said earlier. So, you know, other than Viktor Orban, the Kremlin, and a handful of other like-minded countries, no Western capital has acknowledged the contested election results as legitimate. So what we're seeing at the moment is that these protests are evolving into a grassroots movement that really is not driven by any single political figure or candidate. Instead of rallying behind a specific opposition leader, what we're seeing is that the Georgians are essentially leading the charge themselves. And this is quite important because, yes, they're not going to topple the Georgian Dream, to answer your question more directly, as of yet. But if this movement continues to get stronger and the situation escalates, then what we're likely going to see is that essentially it'll be a single party parliament, which is the case already, that has no legitimacy beyond a handful of so-called friends, including Hungary and Slovakia and Russia and perhaps a couple others, that is unable to really do very much. They will become basically impotent, for lack of a better term, to be able to do much else other than to tell everyone that they have a parliament that doesn't really have any sort of clout anywhere. They will only be invited to a handful of countries. They will be isolated increasingly so over the next few months if they do remain in power. So a Georgian dream without proper legitimacy, especially in the West, is going to be a country and a party that is going to be so isolated that other than being able to celebrate their win with the alleged 54% of the national vote on October 26th, will have very, very little to celebrate beyond that, as they continue to occupy the seats in the parliament with a bunch of other seats that remain vacant.
Now, even as we can, of course, and almost certainly should question the reality of the 54% support.
Yes.
Georgian Dream, it clearly has a popular base of sorts, or at least even if it's only faux demure, that this is the best we can go with. So, I mean, what is the basis? What are Georgians thinking that they allow this to happen? That many of them voted for what was obviously what they considered to be an unpatriotic party.
That's right. That's right. And you make a very good point, Ian. I think the wishful thinking is that all of this was forged and they have no base whatsoever, no support base whatsoever. And that is not exactly accurate. If we're being sort of objective and analytical, they do have a support base, which is all the more disturbing. So it's bad enough that the Georgian
Well, who
dream
is that support base? I mean,
right, who are they? And these
is
are
it the old bureaucracy?
all,
Is it old Communist Party nostalgia? Or,
not necessarily, not necessarily. I think where they did actually do it, where they did make the right move for their own base, was when they started capitalizing in the pre-election campaign on this sort of war versus peace narrative that was all over Tbilisi and outside of Tbilisi as well, where they were essentially saying, if you vote us out and you vote for the opposition, you will inevitably get dragged into essentially a second front in Russia's war in Ukraine. So if you want peace, then vote for us, because there will be stability slash stagnation, but stability is what they were promising them, and peace versus war. And as much as some analysts started to dismiss this claim as, well, this is absolute baloney and nobody's going to buy into it, actually they did buy into it, including those who don't necessarily like this anti-Western rhetoric and the pro-Russian sort of pivot of the Georgian dream. Even those people, and I spoke to a lot of them while I was there observing the elections, they actually pragmatically went ahead and voted for the status quo. So they weren't necessarily voting for the Georgian dream, but they were voting for the status quo because they were so very worried about what they said was a leaderless opposition. Because for a country that has just barely over 3.7 million population, having 4 separate opposition coalitions, not just parties, but coalitions, some of them having multiple parties as part of them, is rather ridiculous, if we're being completely honest.
Especially in the country with the tradition of the voiced.
That's right.
Joseph Jugashvili.
That's
I
right.
mean, leadership is something that they sort of practice rather vigorously.
Yes. And you need a charismatic leader in a country like Georgia. You need a charismatic leader everywhere. But in a small country like Georgia, you do need that one leader where essentially the opposition supporters would rally behind this one leader as someone that could lead them through this chaotic process. And there were so many intra-party and inter-party divisions and grievances and issues that they were unable to essentially form a single front, which is exactly
it's a shame
why
you couldn't get a Georgian footballer playing for Liverpool rather than Manchester City to run as the candidates, isn't it?
Yes, I highly doubt that he will be able to unite the country. But you know, the supporters are really all over the place. The Georgian Dream supporters, there's diehard supporters that they can, you know, who claim that the Georgian Dream can do no wrong. Very similar to the Trump supporters, the diehard supporters here, that no matter what Trump does, good or bad, they will never ever speak up against him and say that, you know, whatever he's doing God's work. You have quite a few of those people in Georgia who support GD very blindly, but then there are also those who claim to be pragmatic, and when they felt that there wasn't enough of a unified front among the opposition coalitions, they said, you know, let's just vote for the status quo. The Georgian Dream is weaker than it's ever been, which is quite true. They're not completely done, but they're much weaker than they were in the prior years. And wait for them to, you know, because their sun is setting, wait for them to essentially leave, but peacefully. But a peaceful transition in the current situation, I think, is something that we can completely write off.
Now, there's also been sort of repercussions because one of the reasons for the intense anti-Russian chauvinism has been Putin's intervention in Abkhazia and other minority areas.
That's right.
So, I mean, there have been some interesting ripples from Abkhazia, which we mustn't forget Abkhazia because everybody does.
Yeah.
So here there's this Russian enclave recognized by Slovakia and I think Venezuela on one Pacific island, I think, who they paid enough to buy an embassy. Yet even they have questions. What's happened there? Because the Abkhazians were revolting against their local equivalent of Abkhazian Dream, I suppose you call them, who were selling, they thought were selling out to Russians.
Yes. For your viewers, just so that we can give a quick recap of what's happening in terms of a snapshot at the moment in Abkhazia. So Georgia's breakaway region of Abkhazia has been plunged into darkness over the past weeks after its only power station shut down, with energy shortages at their peak amid tensions with Moscow heating up as well. The Russians pulled nearly all of their financial support for Abkhazia, hitting the energy sector very hard after Abkhazia's local council rejected a rather controversial investment deal with Russia. So if things were going very smoothly and wonderfully between Abkhazia and Russia, I don't think that the public would have stood up against such a deal. And just as another sort of quick recap, the situation escalated in November when protests flared up in Abkhazia against a law that would essentially let Russians buy property there, which led to the resignation of the region's de facto leader, Aslan Jania, and the council nixed the law on December 3rd. But despite all of the local protests, it's still worth stressing that Russia's grip on Abkhazia does actually still remain strong in the absence of a strong Georgian grip. Though demonstrations keep pushing back against Moscow's influence in this breakaway. And if you recall, when we last spoke with Tom Duval, also on the line with us, we talked about how both Tom and I felt that the Georgian Dream was actually going to use this Abkhazia as well as Tbilisi/South Ossetia card, the breakaway card, leading up to the elections, for them to essentially say that, you know, if you vote for us, then we will get the territory back. Aside from the war versus peace narrative, this one was also factored into their election campaign and did track very, very well with their core voters. But after the contested election, conversations about Georgia getting the breakaways back started to die down, understandably. I think the Russians overpromised and did not really feel the need to deliver at the end. And also, quite frankly,
you mean the Kremlin doesn't keep its promises?
Shame,
shame. Did anyone tell Assad?
Historically, we've never seen anything like that. But for the first time ever, the Kremlin did not keep its promise. And suddenly now they're starting to backpedal. Part of it is backpedaling, but the other part of it, something you alluded to in your question, Ian, is that the Abkhaz population is not all that crazy about being under Russian control either. I mean, if the whole point for them was to leave Georgia because they did not want to feel occupied, then they went from one, if we're playing devil's advocate, they went from one occupation to another occupation. And I've heard a few Abkhaz citizens actually tell me that, quite frankly, we would prefer to be under Georgia rather than under Russia, just given that they made so many promises to them and delivered on nothing. And now they're playing this economic card, essentially bullying Abkhazia and cornering them into signing rather unfavorable and not particularly good, different policies and different deals that the Russians want the Abkhaz to strike with them, at the expense of them saying, well, if you don't, then we will essentially, they're threatening to cut them off, including their electricity, their access to gas, et cetera, et cetera. And all of these bread and butter issues may be what ultimately results in a fallout of Abkhazia and Russia, and not the bigger geopolitical risks that we had been monitoring prior.
So Putin and Lavrov were in effect saying no more Mr. Nice Guy, but nobody noticed it being nice anyway.
That's right. That's right. That's right. The bar has been very low anyway.
So where do we go? Because the key issue,
yes,
seemingly in Syria, was that al-Assad's security forces, his police and his army, realized they were on their own and they're being left to hang out to dry. It wasn't exactly a jumbo jet that flew to Moscow. It was a small aircraft with his family and a few others on there. So everyone else was left swinging in the wind. And just how much support, or let's not so much support. How much do the security forces in Georgia, are they prepared to support the Georgian dream? Because they don't seem, the police seem to be, with how should we say, vigor, beating up demonstrators, which is, there's no. I've seen some signs of the firefighters, for example, refusing to fill the hoses for the water cannon. But I mean, are there any other signs of dissent, within the armed forces and the security forces, or has the Georgian dream got them locked up?
Well, I mean, here and there are, but nothing at the scale that would really move the needle. Allegedly over 100 employees of the Interior Ministry, for example, have reportedly submitted their resignations, but the Internal Affairs Minister is refusing to accept them, which is not surprising at all. I think some are already predicting that the Georgian dream is on the brink of collapse, but I do believe that even if their days and weeks and months are numbered, contrary to wishful thinking, they haven't completely lost power just yet. I think part of it is because of Ivanishvili's financial resources that are not unlimited, but unlimited by Georgian standards. The likely compromise that he's gathered on his party leaders, as well as the security forces, the leadership there, to prevent any major resignations or major defections. And importantly, Russia's continued pledges of quote unquote support, all of these factors play a role in this. And the one thing that I did want to stress here in terms of what could happen, I mean, on a possible Russian intervention that I've heard some analysts talk about, this is a worst case scenario, but since we're talking about all possible scenarios moving forward, if the protests continue at the same scale and intensity, and contrary to what the Georgian dream hopes will be that, either they get tapped out, the protesters, or as they go into their very long and winding and very famous New Year's celebrations that can take weeks and weeks and weeks, right? Because we're talking past old New Year's Eve on January 13th when all of this ends, but really the day after on the 14th of January. And the Georgian dream is unable to keep the situation from spiraling out of control, they may actually need to, not explicitly, because as you said earlier, this would be the end of them if they did so explicitly, but implicitly, they may need to ask for Russia's assistance in terms of giving them the manpower. I want to clarify here that I'm not necessarily suggesting that a Soviet-era military crackdown with tanks and heavy ammunition, like the massacre of April 9th, 1989, would be inevitable. Right, exactly. But we're talking about little green men, exactly. Something along the lines of a Spetsnaz type of an intervention. And that would be very easy to camouflage for them at first. I mean, eventually we will find out, as we did with the little green men. But if they are unable to maintain their grip on the situation, which I think we're moving slowly in that direction, some are refusing. In terms of the riot police, they're refusing to act on the orders that are getting from the top. And others, frankly, are tired because remember when the protests started, the first 3 days were very violent and they were really full on, and there was a lot of energy there. It started to go down a little bit where we saw the riot police starting their intervention and their violent crackdowns much earlier in the evening, so around 7, 8, 9 p.m., as opposed to 3, 4 in the morning. They wanted to go home. They were getting tired. And part of it is them being tired. And the other part of it is that, frankly, they know that eventually the Georgian dream sun is starting to set and eventually they'll be done. And they want to think about their future. And they don't necessarily believe that the Georgian dream is going to have their backs. And I don't think that Ivanishvili would. But we're not at that point where we're seeing mass defections and any formal resignations of the very, very senior level officials, which would, to me, essentially mean that, everybody's leaving and trying to run away from situation where the ship is sinking. It's starting to slowly sink, but it's still staying afloat.
Yeah, I mean, on the Syrian example, when the crisis point comes, it happens very quickly.
Exactly.
Because I think I don't think there's anyone in the world who wasn't surprised by the rapidity of the collapse in Damascus.
Absolutely, absolutely.
But could that happen in Tbilisi? Are people looking at you? You mentioned about the riot police sort of showing signs of second thoughts. Anything more tangible on that?
Not yet. Not yet. And I think it's a little bit premature. And as I said at the beginning of this call, sometimes we have this sort of wishful thinking among my compatriots where we think, oh, this is it, this is the end. And we're not quite there yet, again, because of the vast resources that Ivanishvili has. They're not comfortable, they're worried, but they're still there. And I think for the time being, either this has to continue in terms of the protest movement, this grassroots level protest movement, or there has to be a stronger Western response. And I'm seeing in the chat, we have a question from Mark Seddon, and Mark is sort of talking about the Western response or lack thereof. And that is very unfortunate and something that I do believe that the Georgians on the other side that are not pro-GD, but rather more opposition-leaning and more pro-Western, we're hoping that there would be a stronger response from both Brussels and Washington that would, on the one hand, embolden the protesters that are out there day in, day out, and on the other hand, also help the cause of the opposition coalitions and Georgia's pro-EU president. But we heard repeatedly over the past couple of weeks that Western sanctions related to the situation in Georgia are coming, and yet they still have not materialized. The EU foreign ministers are meeting next Monday on the 16th to discuss Georgia and some of the potential punitive measures, which may possibly include targeted sanctions on the senior government officials and possibly a halt to the country's EU visa-free travel. So Georgian citizens at the moment can travel visa-free to EU countries. And as for the US response, or lack thereof, when earlier this week, on the eve of Human Rights Day, the State Department announced measures to counter global corruption and human rights abuses from North Macedonia, sorry, although North Korea would be appropriate, I think, to Indonesia. They failed to include Georgia on the list of the latest package of sanctions, which did, mildly speaking, disappoint the Georgians that are protesting for days and days on end. And the window of opportunity is shrinking very fast. The Biden administration has very few options remaining in the limited time they've left to make an impact on many global crises. And Georgia, if we're being completely honest, is, it is one of them, but I'm afraid that it's far from a top of mind issue for the administration going through its transition period, and certainly will not be a top of mind issue for the incoming administration either. As other crises dominate the next White House. So here, Georgia is going to end up in this little bit of a limbo, and it doesn't have the sort of security guarantees. For example, NATO. I mean, NATO membership is years and years and years away. And Mark asked this question in the chat. We're talking years. Its EU integration was something that was at least on the horizon already, and even that, the Georgian dream is pivoting away from that. So where does that leave Georgia? I think in many ways, if the Georgian dream does stay in power, and there is no regime change, then the country will be at the mercy of Russia, and vicariously through Russia, China as well, given Chinese interest and increased investments in Georgia's infrastructure.
Well, it bespeaks a certain degree of naivety on the part of the opposition that they put so much faith in the European Union. I mean, yes, I can see it's a big symbolic issue and they want to, but the European Union has been somewhat of has not exactly been erect in the defense of,
That's right.
of freedom in the rest of the world, as the Ukrainians can testify, and as Hungarians who have been trying to vote Orban out can testify. It's very much of a busted flush in terms of international influence. Add that to Trump, and you think, why are you pro-Western? Because the West isn't pro-you, it would appear.
But also, Georgia has no choice. Either it has to be pro-Russian or pro-Western. It's not big enough, despite its very critical and very significant geographic location. It cannot afford to just be pro itself, which is what the Georgian dream has been pushing. It's inevitable. We've seen this happen time and time again in Georgian history. Inevitably, it has to cozy up to another bigger power. Georgia's pro-Western trajectory and orientation was the only way out of the various Soviet legacies that, unfortunately, Georgia, not unlike other post-Soviet states, has been unable to entirely shed.
And it's not strategic enough to invite to put Chinese on the menu.
That's right. That's right. That's absolutely correct.
Mark, you had a question. What was it? I can't see it. Did you say it, Tinatin?
Well, I did answer it partially. I do believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there was a question about NATO. Yes. Is there a serious push by any serious political forces in Georgia to also try and join NATO, which would be the real red line for Moscow? Well, actually, Mark, Georgia's not just EU integration, but also its NATO integration is very much part of the Georgian constitution. So contrary to what we're seeing at the moment coming out of the Georgian Dream's collective mouth, they've been pushing for this for quite a while. Obviously, this started under, I would say, not just President Saakashvili, but also his predecessor, Shevardnadze, who may have been very problematic for Georgia's domestic politics, but actually did a lot of good when it came to...
And was actually Gorbachev's foreign minister.
That's correct, and was excellent at building up the Rolodex for the Georgian government with various Western leaders. So those relationships, that the strategic cooperation and all the rest of it that we're talking about today, it actually didn't just start under Saakashvili. It started very much under Shevardnadze. Something that many of my compatriots forget. Sometimes it makes little to no sense to me. But anyway, I digress. So yes, joining NATO is something that Georgia has been hoping to do for a very long time. But if that's off the table for the time being, for the foreseeable future for Ukraine, it is also absolutely off the table, realistically speaking, for Georgia for the years to come. It's more of a symbolic gesture for them to have put it into the constitution, but it's still very, very important because it's that message that Georgia has to send to the world. I mean, there were rumors right before the election that the Georgian Dream would potentially try, if they were able to secure a constitutional two-third majority, which they did not. But if they were able to do so, then they would have tried to take the various references to Georgia's eventual NATO integration out of the constitution. That has not happened, but even without constitutional majority, that did not stop the Georgian Dream leaders from making that very controversial announcement in late November, which kickstarted this whole protest movement about halting Georgia's EU integration process. So NATO is much, much lower on the bar here, unfortunately.
And it's all very symbolic, since I don't think
Of course.
anybody who's actually experienced the European Union, it might have many fine features, but it's not the savior of small countries.
That is absolutely right. That is absolutely right. And actually, Mark wrote in the chat, don't forget that Putin wanted to join NATO at one stage. He did. He did. So maybe the Georgian Dream has learned from the best.
But not your faith in Viktor Orban, I would say.
Right. Absolutely.
Let alone Erdogan. I mean,
that's absolutely right. That is absolutely right.
So are there any moves afoot? Are we going to get an invitation to the UN Security Council to go into deadlock on the issue?
I don't think so at the moment. I don't think so. I'm afraid not for the time being. I think just in general, as much as it pains a lot of Georgians to admit this, the response that we've been seeing, this very sort of lukewarm response and very symbolic, the usual traditional words of condemnation and criticism coming out of the West, with sadly very little to back it up beyond just words, that will probably continue, just given the reality of where we are in terms of the geopolitical landscape and the environment at the moment. It should not be, but it is sadly not a top of mind issue for those of us in Washington. I mean, we've been pushing for it, but we're seeing very little appetite, and I think that appetite will further diminish under the Trump administration, because I do believe that it'll be more of a businessman to businessman transaction between Evanishvili and Trump. If Trump is able to strike a deal with Evanishvili, or rather, Evanishvili is able to strike a deal with Trump, and he offers him something that Trump cannot refuse, then I think the most that the Georgian Dream can hope for is that the White House and the U.S. administration under Trump will essentially turn a blind eye towards what's happening at the moment, which sadly is exactly what we're seeing under the Biden administration. So it's very easy for us to blame this on the transition period, but I highly doubt that if the Biden administration had actually secured a re-election, that we would have been seeing anything very different, because we've seen this before. I mean, we saw what happened with Gaza, with Palestine, and I'm afraid that that Georgia would also be very, very low on that list of priorities.
What about Georgia as a catalyst, in the sense of looking at it? It's in a sort of tinderbox neighborhood. You've got Azerbaijan, you've got Armenia,
Yes.
you've got Georgia, you've got Turkey. All of these are sort of stirring the pot and carrying lighted matches in a petrol tank. So how are the relations there? It's particularly intriguing for me has always been the Georgia and Armenian one, where it has not exactly been, as the Chinese used to say, as close as lips and teeth.
I have to actually say that the Georgians over the past few years, and this isn't necessarily because of the Georgian Dream, it was already happening under Saakashvili, have been quite good in maintaining very decent relations with both Armenia and Azerbaijan, even despite the ongoing and constantly recurring, flare-ups between, in terms of security and the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, including post-Karabakh. So they've been able to position themselves in Georgia in a way that, they're essentially saying we are part of this because we're part of the South Caucasus, but at the same time, we want to be friendly with Armenia and we want to be friendly with Azerbaijan. As you recall, when the peace negotiation process that is still ongoing started after the last military offensive, the Azerbaijani offensive in September of 2023, Georgia proposed Tbilisi as one of the venues to hold the talks. And the Georgians were actually trying to put themselves in this position to act as a broker, which for a minute or two was considered by both Armenia and Azerbaijan. So they're able to somehow continue this balancing act between the two, and also a rather decent relationship with Turkey. I think where it gets a lot messier is when the Georgian Dream tries to talk about a pragmatic relationship with Russia. That is an absolute no-no for the population. But even to a degree, a decent relationship with Turkey as its strategic neighbor is not something that that repulses the majority of the Georgian population as much as any thought, let alone talks of strengthening ties with Moscow can and does.
So there's no suggestion that Turkey is seen as the sort of instant enemy of Georgian orthodoxy, or the imperialist aggressor.
No, no.
They do seem to have been quite reasonable about it. So, okay, are there any questions from the people out there? Because I can think of loads that this is such a complex situation and there's so many different angles on it. Here we are. Can you see this one?
Yes. Michael's question is about the repression towards lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender communities and how that is playing out. Well, Michael, as I'm sure you know, because you're alluding to this in your question, but for those in the audience who don't, right before the Georgian Dream rolled out the controversial foreign agent law the second time around in the spring of 2024 of this year, they actually tested the waters, so to speak, with another controversial law, which was the LGBT law, similar to the one that we've seen in Russia and other parts of the world, like-minded countries. And contrary to what some may have expected, unlike what we saw with the foreign agent law, there wasn't anything similar to the backlash that we witnessed with the other law. And part of it is because, and this is not a very popular thought that I'm about to voice here, but nonetheless, we have to be brutally honest and talk about things as they are. Georgia can be rather, I would say, mildly speaking, less than tolerant when it comes to such minorities. And the LGBT related laws in the country and in general, the public sentiment towards them, it is certainly not what it should be for a country that is striving for Euro-Atlantic integration. So that is why when this draft law, initially it was obviously a draft law that the Georgian Dream rolled out, the European response and the US response, they were both very strong, but it essentially landed on deaf ears. We saw just a handful or so of people that protested. And then days after, with the Georgian Dream thinking, oh, they somehow got away with it, they decided to roll out the foreign agent law. And that is because the country at the core, when we talk about the majority of the population, remains less than tolerant when it comes to sexual minorities.
Sounds like the United
States. Right. Exactly. So that did not surprise me, sadly, and that law got passed, and we didn't see a whole lot of protests. I think next to what we saw vis-a-vis the foreign agent law, these protests paled next to them. And unfortunately, very few Georgians that I've talked to that are also opposition leaning, this particular legislation is the last thing that is talked about, sadly. And you have the younger population that of course thinks very, very differently, but the older population, somehow they have bought into this, the Georgian traditional values that the Georgian dream is pushing, as somehow LGBT laws, and their rights, would somehow, they believe, go against Georgia's core traditional values, which is of course not the case, but it does track well with their core
But
voters,
it's a
that's for sure.
beautiful wedge issue if you want to
It
show
is.
signs of you're forcing alien culture on
Well,
low.
exactly.
Um,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I mean, you can see that in the Caribbean as well,
Yes.
very strongly.
Yes.
It's the
Absolutely.
people have a lot of work to do to popularize the concepts in their
Sadly.
communities.
Sadly.
It doesn't always work. Is there anybody else, any questions before we begin to move towards the denouement of the Caucasus? One of the things that's amusing me here is that a complete lack of interest from Trump, even though many of his followers would say that they're all for Caucasians, Caucasian rights in the United States. So here we have the original Caucasians,
Right.
and they're ignoring them. I mean, he wants to wash his hands of them,
Yeah. Unfortunately, that is very, very true.
Anybody else? I think we should be moving towards the end now. It's well, this is Ian Williams from the Foreign Press Association in New York, and we've been speaking to our old friend Tinatin Japaridze about a very complex issue, and we look forward to more. The alleged Chinese curse was that may you live in interesting times, and these are horrendously interesting times. Isn't it? The Chinese told Kofi Annan that Confucius, he never said that. After Kofi mentioned it in the speech. But that's the different subject. We can go into that. But it is true that interesting times can be perilous, and there are a few more interesting or perilous times than we seem to be facing at the moment. And we hope that the Foreign Press Association will pursue in future. Samantha, have you got the meetup to put up? We are in the new year having a meetup and drinks in Midtown, Foreign Press Association friends. If you look on our site, you will see it. You are all welcome, and we want to renew in the new year because we have bad times coming for foreign press. Two reasons. One is that this incoming administration is not exactly how should we say, in love with the media, nor is it in love with foreigners. So the foreign press are on a double disability here. And we anticipate some serious attacks on visa rights and the First Amendment privileges, rights of foreign press here. And we want to be prepared for that. So please get any foreign press you know to A, join us, and B, help us draw up our battle plans to protect our immunities. So thank you very much, everybody. Thanks very much, Tinatin. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, carefree Kwanzaa, cheerful Chanukah, whatever is appropriate at the moment. And see you soon, I hope. Bye.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. Bye.